We're going to talk this morning a little bit. I was asked to talk about corn silage production, and we'll talk about establishment and production and the ensiling part of it. Um, Corn silage is a little bit different than most other crops because we sort of have two components to it. We have the grain and the stover. And any other crop like alfalfa or clovers or grasses tend to get higher in yield and lower in quality as they get more mature. Corn silage kind of goes through an improvement and then a decline and ending up with an improvement in quality and yield if it's harvested correctly and Mother Nature participates. The important thing to think about is that we have the grain crop and we have the stover crop as a part of this. And that's why we see that variation in trend. The crop quality is high at pollination, though it's too wet for ensiling, and the yield is less than it could be. If we wait until the grain milk line has moved towards the tip, then we have the addition of the grain and high quality. One of the things that we should always keep in mind when we do an analysis is to look at our silage and the starch content because should be about 40 to 45% of the grain should be 40 to 45% of the dry matter.
Dan, I'm just going to jump in just for a second. I forgot to mention anyone on the call. If you do have questions throughout the presentation, you can either interrupt and ask them or put them in the chat and we can go over them at the end. But Dan doesn't mind having some conversation going through. So just keep that in mind if there are questions that come up.
Sure, thank you. Can you see my cursor moving on the screen?
No.
Okay, well, then we can't do that. Anyway, so one of the important things about corn silage is to keep in mind that it's fairly rich and you need to feed something with it to keep the rumen from getting too acidic after a large corn silage load goes into the rumen. And that's why we usually recommend, in fact, all of our research has shown that the highest milk yields come from something around 25 to 50% of the ration being corn and another 25% being some other forage to keep the rumen from getting too acidic after a feeding. Now, one of the things to keep in mind, and I encourage you to pay attention to this, all over, we've cut the public variety trials that used to be run, but there really is a huge difference in yield potential of corn varieties. We see the same with alfalfa and other crops. But if you look at this graph, you see a peak and then gradually tapering off, and then another peak and gradually tapering off. And those are the yield of all of the entries within one trial within 1 year. And you can see that there's almost a 50% difference in yield between the lowest yielding and the highest yielding. This is grain hybrid, this was corn grain yield, but the same would be true for silage yield. And so the average difference in yield between the top and lowest yielding variety was about 4.3 metric tons per hectare. 1 year we had as much as 7.8 metric tons, whether you chose the highest yielding or the lowest yielding. This is where, not that I sell seed, but really the cost of the seed is kind of immaterial when you look at the cost per acre or per hectare. The real thing that counts is what the yield will be at the end of the year. So it's well worthwhile to pay a little extra for a high yielding hybrid of corn we're talking about here than it is to go for the least expensive one. How do we manage corn grain versus silage types, and I'm going to presume that there's very little grain types in most of your region, but there are a lot of good silage types. The reason I put this table up is because a lot of the recommendations that come through will be for grain, and the question is, how do you adapt this to the silage? Generally speaking, what we're seeing is that our plant populations max out something between 64 and 74,000 seeds per hectare. Now that's the number at harvest, not the number that were planted. So you might need to figure about 10% more for seedling loss and things like that. And then for silage, we seed 5,000 to 7,500 more than we would for grain. Our planting date is early for corn. One of the things we've really changed over the years is adaptation to the early temperatures. We tend to be a bit cooler. And then in addition, we tend to have more disease problems. So between the resistance of the good hybrids and the fungicide seed coating, we do recommend planting earlier to have a longer growing season. With silage, we can wait a week or so later. Then we plant the earliest grain, just because we're looking at total growth and biomass rather than simply grain yield. The row spacing, I'm going to presume that most of the audience has gone to 75 centimeters or 30 inches. This will yield 3 to 5% more than a wider row spacing. Now with silage, the difference is even greater. At 30 inches, we can expect 7 to 9% more tonnage if we go to that 75 centimeter versus a greater width. Soil fertility needs to be adequate actually in both cases, though the fertilizer need is higher for silage because we're removing more organic matter. We're removing potassium and sulfur in particular that we do not take off with the grain. And so we do need, either for the corn silage crop or especially for the crop following it, a little greater fertilizer. Pest resistance is important for both. And we say more important for silage because it has to stand a bit longer in the fall. Harvest timing for grain is determined by drying cost. Some of you and many of our farmers put up high moisture grain to allow them to harvest it before it has dried as much. And certainly if they're harvesting for dry corn, the cost of the fuel to dry is a consideration. For silage, the main consideration is to have it dry sufficiently for good fermentation. If we harvest too early and the moisture content's too high, I say sour corn, moldy, but we might have seepage runoff. We'll lose carbohydrates and other proteins. So when we're selecting corn hybrids, we should go for high grain yield because this allows us dual purpose, and also there's a pretty good association between the grain yield and the total tonnage. But if we have the data more specifically, we want whole plant silage yield. Relative maturity can be 5 to 10 days later than grain hybrids because we're going to go up to frost or can, and we don't need the dry down period that we need for grain. We do need standability, and this is perhaps more important for silage because we want to be able to harvest all of the stalks and leaves, not just the grain. We want good pest resistance, and we'd like silage quality. There are a number of factors that enter into this. There are genetic variations, but an awful lot of the quality has to do with the management that we put into selecting the hybrid and then harvesting it. Here's some row spacing data for us from years. Remember I said a 76 centimeter row spacing. You could go narrower, some do, but really there's not much advantage to it. For 6, 7 years, about dozen, 15 different, 14 different trials, we found a slight advantage, though not always, to the narrower rows. So it's not certainly not worth buying new machinery for. There are the headers for variable rows. Many of you may not have choppers like this, so if you're hiring somebody to do it, some of this might be good. This is a variable header. It can harvest any row width you choose to plant. I'd mentioned population. If you notice here, some of the studies that we've done over a number of locations and years, something around 74,000 plants per hectare gives us pretty much the maximum yield that we would expect to see. Planting date, you see the milk per hectare versus the date that we planted. Generally speaking, we're looking at, as I said, the same planting time as corn for grain or a week later. But let's think about harvest dates. That's always the big question. When do we harvest the corn for silage? And you can get some information on maturity. Hopefully you would take that into account when you select your hybrid to plant. But the old rule of thumb has been to wait for the half kernel milk line, and I'll show you that, which is about 42 or 47 days after silking. So you can kind of look at the silking date midsummer and assume that about 42 days later, you should be paying attention to plant moisture content for harvesting, and that it will follow sometime after that. The other consideration is once the milk line begins to move, and we would actually recommend a measurement of whole plant moisture rather than just milk line, because the different hybrids differ in moisture content at a given milk line. But you can generally figure that unless you have a really rainy period, that the dry down rate will be 0.5% a day. So if you get a moisture content of, say, 60%, you can assume that in 10 days you should be putting that silage in the silo. And we do recommend a final check. Some may have moisture detectors on their chopper, and that's good. But the other approach is to take 3 samples to chop it and measure it. So here is the milk line I was talking about. And this milk line moves from the tip to the base. And so the other way, excuse me, from the outside in towards the tip. This outer side, the yellow is solidified starch. The white portion is the milk, if you will, in the kernel. And so what we're looking for is around half milk line. We should be checking our plant moisture and looking to see what the moisture quality is. And then, like I say, we can use that 0.5% change per day to determine when we should be harvesting. So the important thing to keep in mind is that it does vary a little bit with hybrid. Now I'm just going to show you what we have done over the years is our extension office or some cooperatives offer silage checking, where you can go chop 3 plants and bring it in, and it will be fed through the shredder on the left, and then they will measure moisture content. In this case, they're doing it with NIR. It could also just be stuck in an oven at 100 degrees centigrade overnight, and you'd have the number the next morning and be able to tell what your plant moisture content is. This is the best way to determine. Now, let me go through and just quickly talk. It's possible for you to determine the moisture content at home with a microwave or a Coster tester. They're handheld NIR units or NIR on the chopper. The last two are probably too expensive for most operators, but the first two would have potential. With a microwave, you cut or chop it into about 6 centimeter lengths, microwave for 3 minutes, remove the sample, stir it, and put it back in. And then you start weighing it for 1 minute on a postage scale or something similar until you have zero weight loss and you can determine what the original moisture content was. The alternative is a Coster tester, which has a heat lamp in this metal box on the bottom, and this container has a screen on the bottom. So a fan blows hot air up through the forage, and then you periodically take the forage off and weigh it until there is no heat loss. Now, these units have costed something in the range of $400 or $500 US. So I couldn't find the pictures for this morning. I'm sorry, but some of our farmers have made their own Coster tester. They take a 6-inch or 15 centimeter diameter piece of PVC. They drill a hole in the side and they stick their wife's hair dryer in there. And then they take the colander from the kitchen, they put the sample in on top of that 6-inch PVC, and from the hair dryer blow hot air up through the sample. And then same as here, repeatedly weigh it till there's no moisture loss. Kind of depends on how accommodating the wife is to lose these items from the house. But any one of those three methods, I mentioned putting it in the oven at 100 degrees centigrade overnight, microwaving or Coster testing are all good methods of determining moisture of the forage. The key thing is to weigh it until there's no moisture weight loss. Now, the other consideration, and one reason some farmers have sampled some corn stalks and sent it into a forage is a lab is one to get moisture if they can get it quickly, but the other is to get an estimate of the digestibility. Because if the corn is average, you should cut at an average height, which is about 15 centimeters. If it's lower in quality for one reason or another, you may want to raise the cutter bar a little bit, and then you're just harvesting the upper higher quality portion. You lose some tonnage, as I'll show you, but you will have higher quality forage. So here's an example of 3 different hybrids to cutting height. And what you see is the total yield was, well, we put that at 100%. The milk per acre was then at 100% in the purple. If we cut at 60 centimeters, the yield went down, but the orange bar in the middle, the quality stayed up. So high cutting is a way to sacrifice yield to get higher quality. And whether or not you do that may depend on how important the tonnage is versus how important the quality is. The point is you have a choice and you can control it. Oh, I slipped one. Okay, yeah. So when we're making good silage, we want to harvest at the maturity. We want to make sure we have the correct moisture, which I'm going to tell you for any silage, you should think about harvesting at 60 to 65% moisture. And that would, and as you do that, that is an appropriate moisture, whether you're talking about grasses, legumes, corn silage, small grains, whatever. They all need to be harvested at about the same moisture content. Now, the next thing is chopping, and we want to chop at the correct length. And generally what we'd recommend is about a 1 centimeter chop length for alfalfa grasses and unprocessed corn. If we have a crop processor on the chopper, then we can go to 2 centimeters, which gives us a longer fiber length, and I'll show you, gives us some advantages. With chopping corn, the important thing to consider is that we want some length to have physically effective fiber. We need to recognize that longer chop length results in poorer packing, though at 2 centimeters, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. Yet if we go longer, it would be. But also that the shorter chop length requires more energy for chopping. I didn't get, there we go. The important thing to watch if you don't have a processor is, are you seeing whole kernels of grain in the manure of the cattle? And if you are, like in those yellow circles that popped up, then that means that you're losing energy that could have been fed to your cattle for growth or for milk production, and is something that you should think about the next time, either chopping shorter or having a crop processor. Whole kernels will oftentimes pass through the rumen and the rest of the digestive system and come out in the manure. So what we're looking at is a 1 centimeter length with 20% longer than 4 centimeters to provide fiber. If we process, we're looking at 1.5 to 2 centimeters cut length. So this is unprocessed crop. And again, it's even now, you should go out to your silos, take a handful, and make sure every kernel is cracked or broken. If you see whole kernels, something should change for the next year. Crop processing, you want greater than 90% kernel breakage. It does improve the starch digestion. It does give us greater milk yield and fat percentage. Gives us a little bit less sorting in the bunk. On the other hand, it is more expensive equipment, and it does take more energy to operate. Now, I don't know how many of you hire somebody to harvest your silage, but if you do, this is one of the advantages, is that whoever brings a chopper onto a farm will probably have a crop processor as a part of it. And that's another advantage that you could perceive. So crop processor just great breaks windows. It does give you a wider harvest window, because if you're not going to process, you have to be very careful about moisture content of the kernel. If the kernels get a bit dry, then you can overcome that with crop processing to some extent. So here is something chopped at a 2 centimeter. You can see in the middle there a corn kernel that has been smashed. You can see that the stem in the upper left has been torn apart. And so the microbes of the rumen can get into it and digest it. Now, one of the things about corn when you're chopping, and particularly if you're having someone come in to do it, we strongly recommend checking to ensure that the kernels really are broken. Because frankly, it costs less to run the chopper with the processor spread wide and less processing occurring than it does to produce a really good product. So our recommendation is to take a pail or a basket, take a couple handfuls of the chopped material out of the wagon or the truck, and fill it with water. The leaves and stalks will float, and what you'll have is the kernels in the bottom. And then what you want to do is look at those kernels and determine what percentage are cracked or broken apart. Very simple tool to test whether you're chopping yourself or whether you're hiring somebody. You want to make sure that the kernels are cracked And this is something you can do quickly out in the field as he does the first load. It may often mean that you need some adjustment prior to starting on this particular field due to the maturity of the hybrid, the type of hybrid, or whatever. I just put these pictures in because we do want to keep effective fiber in mind, and we don't want all of the forage to be on the top screen. So what we'd like is, let's see, about less than 50% on the top screen and 6 to 10% on the lower. If we have much more on the lower going through, then we have an issue with our effective fiber. So crop processing is good. Will tend to give slightly greater milk yield and fat because all of the starch is available. I'm going to talk about several things now pertaining to silo management because this is a major issue for most of us. I know some of you put silage in tubes and some of you do it in piles and some in bunkers, and all are equally good if they're managed appropriately. In all cases, inoculants can be beneficial. The inoculants will basically, the lactic acid bacteria will ferment sugars and help preserve it. I'll mention Buchneri in the third presentation coming up. The main thing that adding an inoculant does is that it ensures that the fermentation goes the direction you want. It helps the fermentation get started faster. There are always some bacteria natively on the corn or any other crop you're ensiling, but maybe not enough to really get things going the way you want. And inoculation will help stimulate that, thereby reducing heating loss, reducing protein solubilization, and preventing the growth of undesirable microbes. There are a number of bacteria that can be used. You can also get enzymes, but we have recommended bacteria because they're less expensive. The main one would be Lactobacillus plantarum, the first one, but there are 3 or 4 other bacteria that are often included in the mixture. The consideration should be that you should provide 100,000 or 10 to the 6 colony forming units per gram of forage. We do recommend a liquid inoculant over dry. If you buy a dry powder, we'd recommend that you mix it and make the liquid to apply. If you are mixing the inoculant with water, you want to be sure to use unchlorinated water. Most of you probably have that, but I have run into people that didn't think about that, and the chlorine will kill the bacteria. The other thing is that the inoculant should be applied at the chopper, not at the pile or the bunker. The inoculum is like spray paint. It sticks and stays wherever it lands. So if you don't have every side of every particle covered, the inoculant is not going to be effective. In fact, I would go so far as to say if you aren't going to apply the inoculant to the chopper, don't waste your money buying any inoculant. I see a lot of people spray it on the bunker, and every study has shown it just does absolutely no good. So put it on at the chopper or not at all. Principles of ensiling. Just quickly go through. We have 5 phases that we talk about. And the first one is the anaerobic phase. And that's what the stage that you're at when you're filling the bunker or the tube or making the pile. This is the stage during which this initial heating occurs. And this is why it is so important to fill that bunker or pile, preferably certainly in less than 2 days, preferably in one. You know that, for example, if you have left some chopped forage in a chopper wagon overnight, it can be so hot by morning that you can't touch it. And that means that you have lost a lot of energy. You have allowed a lot of microbes to grow that you don't want. So filling the bunker quickly is a really important consideration. Same thing with tubes, though you have some advantage in that the back part of the tube should be aerobic and it's just the face that is left open. The next step that I showed you, the 5, is when that green line, the bacteria start to build up, the lactobacillus, and start breaking down the sugars and producing lactic acid. As that happens, if you follow the blue line, then you see that the pH of the silage falls. And for corn, we should expect 4.2 to 4.5 pH. Once it gets that low, then the bacteria themselves die out because they can't operate at such low pHs. But as long as the silage is anaerobic, neither can anything else grow in there. I have been in some silos where the silage was 20 years old, 20, and it was still as good as when it was first fermented because it had remained airtight that whole time. And that silage will remain that way until you open up the bunker or tube and start to feed it out, because then you're letting oxygen back in. And we'll talk more about that later. So there's the ferment. So we have the anaerobic phase, the phase to build up inoculum, the fermentation phase, and then the storage phase. So again, I just can't tell you enough. Harvest at the correct moisture, 60 to 65% moisture. And that's 35 to 40% dry matter. Chop short, depending on whether you have a processor. I said 1 centimeter there. Remember, up to 2 for processor. Fill rapidly, 2 days or less, and then pack well.
So Dan,
Now,
if producers are harvesting and it's not that correct moisture, what are they going to see if they're on the wet side or the dry side? What are some indications going to be for them?
okay, if you're putting it up too wet, first off, that's when we have seepage out of tubes. and that seepage contains energy and contains protein. So if you ever have a tube or a bunker that seeps liquid, you put it up too wet. Putting it up too wet is also when we can get butyric acid to form. And if you've never seen that, it really stinks. And in fact, the cattle will not eat it if the butyric acid is very high. Now, if you're on the dry side, it just won't pack as well. And then you'll have issues with feed out. You might look towards taking more off the face when you feed it out. This is one of the nice things. I presume some of you put up baleage, which of course doesn't work for corn silage, but does work for all other crops. And then you can put the silage up at less than 60% moisture with no problem. The 60% lower limit is for packing. Thank you for the question. So why is silage density important? Well, at high density, we have less dry matter loss, less heating during feeding, less heating in storage, and less at feed out. The other thing we don't think about is I see a number of even tubes, but bunkers and piles that are maybe only 2/3 as dense as they should be. Well, that means you could have 1/3 more dry matter in the same volume of silage if you had packed it well. So do think about storage capacity. We don't. Packing is crucial, and it is one of the biggest challenges that we've had as we have moved from our tower silos to our bunkers. Here's an example of silage. Our delivery rate in this case was 30 tons per hour. I'm sure yours is not that, but you can determine a little more or less. If our silage dry matter was 0.35, or that would be 65% moisture, as I talked about. Then in the first column, we packed with a 10 centimeter thickness and a 5,800 pound tractor. And our silage density on a dry matter basis was about 200 kilograms per cubic meter. We'd like 240. The other way of looking at it is on an as-fed basis. And there, our desired density on an as-fed basis is about 700 kilograms per cubic meter, 700. Think about it, it's about 3 times this. In the middle column, you can see the person made the same silage with the same tractor, used a 15 centimeter packing layer thickness, and his density was 20 kilograms, 25 kilograms per cubic meter less. And that's going to cause some heating. That's going to cause some problems on feed out. Now, the other issue is taking all the same conditions as the second column, but using a heavier tractor. And you see he got up to 202 kilograms per cubic meter. Neither of them are quite what we'd like, but they're both better than the middle column by a long shot. And I'll show you a spreadsheet in a minute that's available. I can send to your extension service, and you can do a little planning with the equipment you have about how much you want to, how you might adjust things to get an appropriate packing density. Let me say as well that packing density is also variable in a tube. And we did some studies, and frankly, it depends on the operator, the person filling the tube. How they run the filling machine determines the density of the silage in that bunker. If we're filling bunkers and packing, we do recommend a progressive wedge. Do think about that 3-to-1 ratio there. And the reason we recommend that slope is because you don't have to worry about the tractor falling over backwards. You're putting more downward weight on things. Think about that range. And again, our standard recommendation over the years has been 15 centimeters. But as I just showed you, whether you, that's, we think is a certain efficiency. And on the other hand, you might need to go thinner if you don't have the tractor weight. This is the spreadsheet I was talking about. You can plug in your own numbers. Here you see somebody was bringing in 50 tons per hour, same moisture content, 15 centimeter thickness, and he needed 2 tractors, one at 11 and one at 9, to get up close to, and he wasn't still where we'd like it yet. Packing is a big issue. In fact, one of the things we've recommended to some people is good packing may require a bigger tractor than you have. It may be worthwhile to rent a big tractor from somebody for the few days you're filling the bunker, just to have the weight and get good packing. We think about a tractor for the chopper, but the packing weight is the most essential. And what you see in this spreadsheet would give you, we're looking at the first line below the red line of the box. with these two tractors and that tonnage coming in, he was getting a density of 658 kilograms per cubic meter. We'd like to see 705. On a dry matter basis, this is about, he was getting second line from the bottom, 2/3, 230 kilograms per cubic meter. The one in the middle, I want to point out, what we're really talking about is porosity. How much airspace is there? And what you see on this spreadsheet is when he's packing to 658 kilograms per cubic meter, he still has 44% open space in that bunker. 44% is airspace. And that's what lets air move in so easily. Well, first off, he didn't push it out, so it took longer to start fermenting. Secondly, when you go to feed out, it'll move in farther and faster. Do think about packing. Here's some examples I've seen people use. We think about big, heavy tractors, as you see the big one in the middle right. But look at just to the left of that, somebody used a cement mixer for packing. At the very top, you see a wheel that's used for packing highways, used for packing silage. All of these are good tools. The other important consideration is if you're going to use your own tractor, add some weights to it. In the upper right, you see somebody built a cement block that he would pick up on his 3-point hitch and use. And in the lower left, you see weights on the back of the tractor. And he actually has some behind the blade too, doing everything he can to increase the weight on that tractor for greater packing.
We're starting to see that more in Nova Scotia too, Dan, that implement you had right in the middle with the rollers on it. We're starting to see a lot more of those where it says silage packer. We're starting to see a lot more of those type of pieces on the back of tractors too while we're packing.
Yeah, and those are good tools. Anything that will give you weight is good. Thank you. So let's talk a little bit about silage packing. Here's an example of a bunker that we've photographed. You see the silages have to be alfalfa, but the principle's the same. The wall of the bunker's here. This is the top of the pile. He's got plastic on top with tires, and this is the bottom of the face. Now, if we take an infrared picture of this, oh, these arrows are off just a tad, but this green line is along the bottom. That was packed well. This red line is the top and of the pile. And so that was not packed well. Obviously, the person got a little hurried and quit packing to put a bunker cover. It may have been it was necessary, but what this means is that oxygen is moving back in further where it's less dense, it's heating more, you're having energy loss. Here's an example of a couple other bunkers. Here you see the green would be the well packed on the lower right, and the red across the top is the less well packed or the material that got hotter. Here's another one. Now this one actually has red on the bottom. He didn't pack as much to start with, packed better as things got going. And you can tell then that what this shows you is if you start poor, you're going to have a poor spot. You can't make up for it by packing the top more. And here's an example. I decided these two, the middle and the right one, were probably left-handed tractor drivers that didn't get over to the right side as much as they should have. Just kidding. Okay, let's think about spoilage. And a common mistake is when you see some brown material like that layer there between the two bars or black, that is not the amount that's spoiled. That's the amount that is left after spoilage occurred. And generally what you should figure is that that dark brown or black layer, you lost 3 times more depth than what the thickness of that layer. After spoilage, only 1/3 of the spoilage material remained. And that's what you see there. This started out at 0.9 meters. The top fermented down. You've got 18 centimeters of spoiled layer and 38 centimeters left. This fellow lost 60% of the silage in that bunker. Now, the spoiled material, if you have dark material that is spoiled, don't feed it. Load it up and haul it out in the field. Here is some data, actually from the study with those other bunkers, where they fed differing amounts of spoiled material in with the good silage, 5.4, 10.4, 1.6. I want you to see that the digestibility of the good material was 62. With 16% spoilage material, it lost almost 10 points of digestibility. Not only is digestibility a problem, but the cattle don't like the spoiled material and they won't eat as much. And what you see in the good silage here, the intake was about 2.36 or 7. With 16% spoiled material, it was about 2.05. They lost about 0.25% of body weight feed intake. So the feed intake was less, the digestibility was less, and so you'd expect less weight gain, less animals. I do recommend lining the bunker walls. I'll show you why in a minute. If you have a bunker, you do want to put a good layer over the top. There are some 2 layer thicknesses that work well, but the important thing is to put a layer over the top. Here's the reason why I recommend plastic on the sides. If the side is made out of slabs or blocks, what you see is that oxygen moves in, and see this fella, this dark brown material here against the wall, that's all spoiled material that's lost. Note that this person also had a layer of spoiled material on top. This person lost a high percentage of what they put in the bunker. So generally, when we're making piles or bunkers, if we have a bunker, line the walls. If you have a pile, I actually recommend putting plastic underneath it too, so oxygen doesn't come up from the soil. You will see in piles put on the ground 2 things. One is in the wet spring, they get a lot of dirt. If you can build a pile on a layer of plastic or concrete or pavement, that reduces your loss and reduces the amount of soil you put into the silage over winter. I have seen people that have added as much as 20% dirt because the surface was muddy and they scooped it up into their feed mixer. And of course, dirt didn't help the animal performance any. Cover the top with plastic within 24 hours. Consider an oxygen barrier film. The reason we say that is because plastic is a pretty good barrier, but an additional true oxygen barrier will reduce the loss even less. Under typical plastic, you do see usually a few inches of loss in browning. Overlap joints by 1 to 2 meters. Inspect and repair holes in the plastic with tape. I put this up just quickly as an average analysis, fermentation analysis. And I'm actually just going to look at a couple things here. Let's take the corn silage, which was 20 to 65% moistures we'd recommend. You should expect a pH of around 4, plus or minus a little. Should expect 5 to 10% lactic acid, not so much acetic acid, unless you add Buchneri. And of course, the other big thing is we'd like less than 0.1% butyric acid, because that's the bad smelling one that reduces animal intake. I put these pictures in. The one on the right doesn't show it very well, but I think you can see on the left there, that silage that's been opened is at 120 degrees. That's Fahrenheit, actually. But that's still pretty hot. That means, and you should interpret heat over winter as a loss of energy that you could have been feeding your animals. The one on the right is down around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And the difference is the packing and in this case, the use of Buchneri. Another thing to consider with piles and particularly is to make the slope sufficient that the tires stay up on the plastic. And here's an example where this slope was too steep, and you see the pile of half tires off to the left that slid off the plastic. Then there was no weight on the plastic, and you'll tend to have greater loss. And again, you see a layer of loss on top of this pile. So this is a pile that's been packed well. This is one that has plastic on the sides, and then they will layer it over and put sandbags. Now, the other thing, I mentioned density being important because it gets fermentation started as you squeeze the oxygen out. Density is important because you get more dry matter tonnage in the same space. But density is really crucial because it reduces heating when you go to feed out the silage. If you have more porosity, and we'd like to see less than 0.4 of the space, 0.4 out of 1 being airspace. On the right, you see more porosity. On the left, you see less porosity. We'd like the porosity to be less than 0.4. And what that amounts to is that's 705 kilograms per cubic meter or 225 kilograms dry matter. Now, what happens is when you go to feed out of a tube or a bunker or a file, you expose that face to oxygen, and oxygen starts to move into the face. And that oxygen allows microbes to grow and produces the heating. So the less you pack it, the more oxygen moves in. Now, if you're at that 700 kilograms per cubic meter, our data would suggest that oxygen will move in still about 60 centimeters. So if you're taking 30 centimeters a day off, then that face is only, or that silage is only exposed to oxygen for 2 days before it's fed out, and that's not too bad. If your density is less, and we saw some of these down around 600 kilograms per cubic meter, then the oxygen will move in 1 to 1.5 meters. And then that silage is exposed to oxygen for several days before it is fed out. Now, this is why making the size of the pile or the bunker is crucial to you. And I just took an example here. It's not going to be right for anybody, but it gives an example of how we figure this. If you're going to feed 20 kilograms of silage, that's as fed per day to 25 cows, that's 500 kilograms per day. If your bunker is 5 meters wide and 1.5 high, and we want to remove 30 centimeters or 1/3 of a meter per day, and if the density is 705 kilograms, like we say, that's 1,586 kilograms of dry matter that you must remove every day to be taking 1/3 of a meter off the face every day, or 3/10 of a meter. So sizing your bunker is crucial. Now's a good time to think about what you're doing. Oftentimes piles are made based on the space instead of how much you can feed out. So think about a width and height based on the number of animals that you intend to feed and the amount you tend to take out. That's just another calculation of the same. So here is the time to remove 90 centimeters. That's 6 days. Most of us aren't going to do that. If we're down around 30 centimeter removal per day, you see on the bottom, then we're taking the silage out and it's not exposed to the oxygen so long. Now, the other thing that you can do, if you have to pay attention to how much feed you're going to take out, you can adjust the width of the pile particularly. I have seen some people actually cut bunkers in half and fill 2 halves, but the other choice is to determine the height of the silage. And we don't often think about this. And here I show the number of cows that you need to have to consume 30 centimeters per day. So if it's 3 meters high, you need over 100 cows. Think about that. Now, the other thing I'll just throw out quickly is from a bunker or pile, not so much a tube, the moisture content varies daily. And you can imagine this, on a rainy day, it picks up moisture. On a hot, sunny day, it loses moisture. And so we measured then the NDF percentage, we measured the dry matter. And what you see is a pattern here. We tend to have rain come through every 3rd or 4th day, sometimes a bit oftener. But when rain comes through, the dry matter goes down. When the sun shines, the dry matter goes up. So on your feed out, this becomes important, because if you're feeding so many kilograms per day, if it has more water, you're not giving the cows as much dry matter. If it has less water, you're giving them more. So it is important to have some understanding of what's happening. The other thing is important to have a good cover and a straight face. We do recommend using on a bunker or a pile some kind of facer. These have a rotor that cuts, or you can use a rake. We do not recommend just a loader, because if you go in with the loader and lift up, you're lifting up a layer of silage and letting oxygen back in for the next few days. So some kind of a rake or rotor is a good idea. Tubes are an excellent idea and work very well for when you have fewer animals. So generally, let's harvest at 60 to 65% moisture. Use milk line to determine when to start sampling. Chop so all kernels are broken. Pack to 705 kilograms per cubic meter, and feed at least 30 centimeters per day from the base of either a tube, a bunker, or a pile. All right, I'll have time for any questions.
Thanks, Dan. That was some great information. So yeah, we do have a question in the chat here, Dan, so we can start with that. It said, if you need to take more than 2 days to fill a bunker, is it considered okay if always adding new layers at the top every day until the bunk is full?
Yeah, it's really not a good idea. The best would be if you need to take more than 2 days. First off, consider smaller bunkers. Secondly, uh, fill up the back and cover it and start working towards the front so that the entire surface area of the bunker is not covered, is not uncovered and exposed to oxygen. Is there another question?
Yeah, there's another one in the chat here. As we push higher relative maturity hybrids for our region, do you think we need to reduce planting population?
No. Next question.
So you would still want to see that. What was the number of plants?
Yeah, I'd still like to see around, 70 to 74,000 plants per hectare. If you're looking at a later relative maturity, that's really kind of taking that into account.
Okay.
Dan,
Yes.
hi, it's Shane Wood at Perennia. My question is, what is maybe a basic or common thing that you see that is the biggest mistake with corn silage?
What is the biggest mistake?
Or most common mistake that's maybe something that's very basic, but you see it come up time and again when you visit farms or you have discussions with producers.
Well, with bunkers and piles, the biggest one is lack of packing, no question. Um, and I've seen some of the worst silage ever in Nova Scotia. You get white mold in there. I was out to one farm where the fellow was having all kinds of herd health issues. We went out and looked at his silage. It was a tube actually, and it was just covered with white mold. So I would say the biggest struggle that we had when we shifted, tower silos packed themselves. When we shifted the bunkers, we had to really press hard to get farmers to pack adequately because you can't see it. Keep in mind that the face of that bunker, if you take your fist and push it up against it, should be about like hitting sheetrock. And if you can get it to go in half an inch, then you haven't packed it enough.
Okay,
That
thank
may
you.
not have been the answer you wanted, Shane, but that's my answer.
No, that's actually what I'm looking for, something like that. I spoke with another forage specialist in Alberta, and he said this is for perennial forages, but one of the biggest mistakes that he sees with that is people still have issues at seeding, getting the right seeding depth. So I wasn't sure if there was a similar kind of idea around corn silage that there's a basic thing that some producers are just missing, and it's a common thing seen by people who get to visit a lot of farms and a lot of different areas in the continent.
Yeah, I guess I didn't put seeding rate as the first issue because if your seeding rate's not many people overseed because seed's fairly expensive. If you underseed, you're going to reduce yield a little bit, but you'll still get a stand. But if you don't pack the silage well, you're not going to have a good product if you did everything else right all summer.
Great, thank you.
All right, Dan. Is there another question?
We have another one in the chat here. When filling bunks with the wedge method, do you see any issues with inconsistency during feeding out process, dry matter changes or other changes in quality as silage comes from different fields throughout the day when filling the bunk?
Well, I would say less so because when you do progressive wedges, and the individual may be thinking of layers horizontally across the top of a bunker versus a wedge. But if you look at that data I showed you on moisture, the moisture varies more with the weather of the day before or two before than it does what you put in the bunker. The moisture will somewhat equalize across layers from different fields, but the face of the bunker will change daily depending on whether the sun's shining or it's raining.
Are there any other questions out there? Any from my colleagues or others at Perennia, or just any other producers in the room might have some more questions? We have Dan for a couple more minutes. Just in the meantime, I'd like to thank him for taking the time. We are doing a 3-part series, so this was the first one. Next week, the same time, is going to be around nitrogen in forage and legume production. And then the last one is going to be on silage again, but more as a grass forage silage. So be sure to sign up for those if you're interested. I'll just leave the floor open for another minute or two, see if there's any more questions.
So we didn't really spend much time on seeding corn silage, but I always tell people if they don't take the time and do a good job with planting depth and spacing and get a good emergence, that you'll never make up for that with fertilizer. Would you agree?
Yeah, that's right. And do keep in mind that 74,000 plants I said is the number of plants at harvest, not the number of seeds you put in the field. And so what you have to think about is that there's going to be a few losses to emergence, a little that don't germinate, but depending on how far you are, you'd like to see a plant about every 10 to 15 centimeters down every row. And if you don't have that, then first you'll have a lot of weed problems. Secondly, you will lose yield as it gets much less than that. Does that answer your question?
Yep.
Do you disagree?
No. Another one here in the chat. Can you elaborate on the correlation on seeding and soil temperature as far as germination, etc.?
Yeah, so we used to say to wait till the soil temperature was up, darn, you're going to have to help me here, 55 Fahrenheit, whatever that is, centigrade. Tell me when I'm done. But now we're arguing
About
planting.
13 degrees.
How much?
About 13 degrees.
13 degrees. Okay, but now we're telling people they can plant at, frankly, as low as 10 or 11 degrees with fungicide. The main issue of it coming up in the cooler soils is it comes up more slowly and it's more likely to have disease issues. And as we put fungicide on it, and they've kind of done, I think, a little bit of breeding of corn for cooler environments. Remember, corn comes from Central and South America, Northern South America. So it's really adapted to warmer temperatures. But we have pushed to develop early planting to get a slightly longer growing season. Thank you for the help, Daniel.
Yeah, no problem.
I'm pretty good on the English to metric. I just have never picked up temperature.
Sure. Another question here. What's your thoughts on the Inogen corn? And do you think there's an advantage to the kernel digestibility?
Well, yes, there is. And we've looked at it. The problem is that it's also more susceptible to diseases and insects. And frankly, I think it's you're taking risk if you go that route. I would consider a standard hybrid with good kernel processing or kernel cracking, and then we don't see a huge difference.
Okay. And another question, if you're putting up silage that you know is a little dry, is there any way to adjust the moisture?
Not really. I mean, seen, in fact, even my dad used to sometimes put water on the silage.
Yeah, stick the hose on it for a bit.
But think of how much that takes. If you're bringing in 30 tons an hour and you want to increase it 2 or 3% moisture, uh, you have to put on several tons of water per hour, and most people don't have the capability of doing that.
When planting, should any producer use lubricants like graphite, etc., or any other additives mixed in with the seed in the seed box?
Sometimes that can be of an advantage on some of the smaller seeded forages, especially small grains, but I've not seen any advantage to corn of using a lubricant.
Okay, and a follow-up to that says, does it help in any way to get better plant spacing or secure from diseases?
No, the main thing about plant spacing is to make sure you have a good drill. You want to make sure that the mechanisms for dropping the kernels are not worn, particularly some of the new air seeders and so on. Are the gears in good shape? And then is your whatever you're using as a drill, do you have fairly consistent soil depth? You'd like to put that corn in about an inch. I shouldn't tell you this. I have planted corn as deep as 12 inches. And about 30% made it up. But 1 inch is the recommended. You want to be deep enough that the soil surface doesn't dry out excessively in bright sunlight. And you want to be not so deep that it takes longer for the leaves to get above the ground.
And to follow up to that again, they're asking, what is your opinion on a high-speed planter?
On what?
On a high-speed planter?
Well, I have no problem with that. The main thing is to look at how the seed distribution is. And if it's coming out pretty good, and most of the fungicide has a color to it. You can seed a few feet and go kind of dig up and see what your spacing is. If you're getting good and uniform spacing, it's fine. If you don't, use another drill.
Is adding inoculant at the blower for tower silo as good as at the harvester?
Yes, in all cases. I didn't realize there were many tower silos left in Nova Scotia. We still see them along the countryside here. They're used mainly for grain now, but yes, the inoculant, a tower silo, whether it's a harvester or concrete, compresses the forage. That's good. Inoculant will, once the oxygen is squeezed out, cause the fermentation to go in the right direction. It's important to remember that all the studies we've done have said you don't always need inoculant, but we see a return over investment about 70% of the time. So we think it's worthwhile.
All right, we got about 8 more minutes left on our schedule here with Dan, so we'll wait another minute, see if anything else comes in the chat. If not, you feel free to head out and continue your day, and hopefully we'll see you next week. But we'll just hang around here for another minute, Dan, and see if there's any
Sure.
last questions. I'd like to thank everyone for joining. I think we had 33 participants at our height there, so that was great. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you for the next 2 sessions.
One of the other things I didn't mention about silage put up too wet, and you may not see so much of that, but if you go a little bit further west in Canada, or if we go to northern Wisconsin or Michigan or Minnesota, when it stays down above at 20 below zero, and that's centigrade, 20 below zero for a week or two, that silage will freeze solid. if it's at a very high moisture level. If it's in that 65 to 60% moisture range, it'll freeze, but it doesn't freeze like a solid block, and that's important to us.
One more here about seed depth. Says going back to the seed depth, is 1 inch the desired number, or is it closer to 2? Does it help plant strength if it is a bit deeper than 1 inch?
Well, first off, our recommendation is 1 inch. We don't see any advantage to going deeper unless you're in a very light soil that might dry out. So if you're in a sandier soil, you could go a little deeper. If you're a loamy or a silty soil or clayey soil, then you want to stay at around that inch.
And do you have, is there any more yield loss if going more than 1 inch?
Not as long as you get the stand to come up. So the key thing again is how many plants you had through the growing season and at harvest time. And Dan, you might want to think about this with your individuals. You could put a nice little table together on row width versus plant spacing to get to 60 or 70,000 plants per hectare. And that way a person can go out in the field anytime after it comes up and, oh, these plants are so many centimeters apart and therefore your population is this and such.
Right. Okay. There's one more here on any suggestions on traits to look for or other tips when planting corn on ground that is a heavier clay soil.
I was just trying to think. The main problem is, can you get in the field?
Right.
No, I mean, clay soils are wonderful and they hold water through dry periods. The problem is always to get the stand planted because it has to be dry enough that you can go in. You want to make sure that the slit with the seed closes. So there are a few extra little things you have to pay attention to, but mostly there's not too much you can do about it. Just have to wait for the right day. And that may be that means you plant a little bit later.
Okay. Well, seeing no other questions, Dan, I'm going to call that a day. And again, thank you very much. We look forward to seeing you next week. And yeah, we'll let everyone get back to their day, and don't forget to sign up for the next 2 sessions. I don't know if my colleagues have anything else to add before we wrap up, but thank you, everyone.
Well, and thank everybody for participating, and look forward to seeing you around somewhere sometime.
All right, thanks, everyone.